Well, America's proxy war with Russia has transformed Ukraine into a graveyard. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's written a new piece for the American Conservative. And among the things he highlights is this change in strategy on Vladimir Putin's part, an awareness that this incrementalism, this sort of step-by-step approach, might not have been working. And now the new move by Vladimir Putin and the Russian army over the past couple of months has been devastating for Ukraine. What will NATO do now in the wake of this graveyard? Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. Colonel, great to see you. Great piece. Really, really interesting. And I hadn't heard this before, this deep change in strategy on the part of Vladimir Putin and the Russian military.
Well, Putin, as I point out in the article, is someone who believed in rational choice theory. Rational choice theory says that if you give people the opportunity to make a decision, they will always be rational. They will always choose something, some option, whether it's in politics, economics, doesn't make any difference, that it aligns with their own personal best interests. Well, that's not true, Clayton. People are not rational. People are irrational. That's the problem with all the rational choice theory and analysis. And Putin, when he began this thing, imputed rationality to us. When he first entered Ukraine, he was absolutely convinced that after 15, 16 years of telling us repeatedly, don't move NATO's boundary closer to Russia, don't militarize our neighbors against us, we won't tolerate hostile nations on our borders, and especially we will not tolerate a Ukraine that is hostile to Russia and a base of operations against us. He said, well, if I move into Ukraine with, at the time he had about 200,000 troops, and he initially went in with 90,000 on a very broad front. And he gave explicit orders, avoid collateral damage, don't harm civilians, give the Ukrainians a chance to surrender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He thought that as soon as he demonstrated his seriousness with military power, that Washington and its allies would say, now, wait a minute, let's stop. We don't want this to become a larger war. We need to talk, because that was, in his estimation, the rational response. So he miscalculated. What he got instead was the opposite, where Washington was actually goading him, if you will, or baiting him into going into Ukraine. They were delighted he went in because they reached the erroneous conclusion that this was their opportunity to destroy Russia, to mire it in this endless war that would sap them of strength and so forth. So he went along for a while, and then when it became clear, when Boris Johnson showed up very suddenly in April and said, look, Mr. Zelensky, you can't make a deal. Don't accept neutrality. We will stand behind you. We will give you everything you need. You will have the total scientific industrial strength of the United States and its allies behind you. You're going to win. I think Zelensky believed it. And I mean, honestly, why wouldn't he, given the track record of the last 50, 60 years? But everyone miscalculated, what Russia would do. And Russia had to make a change in strategy. They couldn't go on with this small force and expect to get anywhere. So they went over to the strategic defense. They occupied the areas that are populated by Russians in southern Ukraine. They built up these defenses. They consolidated their position. And to their surprise, when they invited the Ukrainians to attack them, the Ukrainians were stupid enough to do so. And so starting in November, December, all the way until really within the last week or so, the Ukrainians have hurled tens of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks and guns and so forth at these defenses. So the strategy of defense has worked. But the problem now is that Putin understands that it doesn't seem to make any difference to people in the West. It doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die. They don't seem to care. He thought that they would be as horrified by this as he is. He wants an end to the war. He still wants to negotiate. No one in Washington is prepared to do that, and everyone is stonewalling him. And even worse, there's some evidence now that the Poles, Lithuanians may be interested in some sort of intervention that they claim they would execute on their own without being part of NATO. And this is absurd because they are in NATO. And if they go into Western Ukraine, they will be treated as NATO forces. This opens up Poland, Lithuania, and anyone else who may join this insanity to being attacked by the Russians. You recall that just about a week and a half ago, the Russians attacked this port of Reni on the river that separates Romania from Ukraine. And this particular port was devastated by hypersonic missiles and drones and so forth. And everyone was horrified. They said, this is right on the border with Romania. Well, that was the point. The Russians were trying to say, look, you cross this border and you go into Ukraine, this is what's going to happen to you. So here we sit and we're trying to figure out what are we going to do? And Jake Sullivan says he wakes up every day and is trying to find more artillery ammunition because we have no more and we can't produce anymore. And he's trying to ramp it up. Well, under those circumstances, does it make sense to continue to ask Ukrainians to die by the thousands? And a friend of mine who is in a position to watch all of this from space-based surveillance tells me that the battlefields are littered with Ukrainian dead. They can't even pick them up anymore, or they're not bothering to do so.
Wow.
The hospitals are full of broken soldiers who will never return to active duty. And no one really knows how many have died, but the estimates are about 300,000 to 350,000 dead.
Jeez,
and of course, Ukraine, people continue to leave. We now think 14 million people have left Ukraine. That leaves maybe 18 million, depending upon how you want to calculate it. This is a catastrophe. Ukraine is being destroyed. So when is someone going to step forward and say, for humanitarian reasons, if nothing else, this must end? And that's why I said, if you don't do this, the Russians are finally going to say, well, that's it. The only way we're going to convince these people that it's over is if we march down the main streets of Kiev. We go all the way to the river and cross the river. And of course, anyone with any sense at all in NATO would say that's the last thing we want. We set out to prevent the Russians from moving west. We thought Ukraine was going to be a bulwark against Russia. Now we've created a monster. No one wants to go there. No one wants to admit that this was a very flawed policy from the beginning.
You write in your piece, make peace, you fools. And it's the opposite of what Jake Sullivan dreams of when he wakes up in the morning. How can we send more munitions into Ukraine? How can we send in more weapons, more armored vehicles, more F-16s, more things that we don't even have at home? How could we ship more of it there? And
well, when you have large numbers of Ukrainians deserting, I mean, they're not stupid. Ukrainian soldiers see the losses. They can't make any headway against these defenses. They're not trained for it or equipped for it. So many of them are just giving up. Some are trying to get home, and they're trying to avoid being shot by the secret police behind the lines. Others have decided, well, we're going to surrender. And the Russians have always treated Ukrainian soldiers very well, in contrast to the way Ukrainians have treated Russian soldiers. So this is a disaster. We should see the facts, make the right choice. But this statement, make peace, you fools, was actually lifted from a German general in 1944 after the landings in Normandy in the summer. And this four-star German general was asked by Hitler and others, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? He said, make peace, you fools. That's the answer. He was correct. That's what should happen now. But even worse, if you look at the broader world condition, Russia has always had the ability, thanks to its alliance with China and its friends all over the world, and they have huge numbers of friends right now. There are lots of people cheering on Russia. We're in the minority in terms of support. They can escalate horizontally. So in Africa, for instance, in Niger and other countries in what we call Afrique du Nord, French Northwest Africa, these states are effectively throwing the French out. They're staging coups and putting in governments that are now friendly to Russia and anti-Western. And in the case of Niger, they represent probably 50 to 60% of the uranium that is exported every year to France to power their nuclear power plants. Well, without Niger, and Niger is now in the hands of an anti-Western government, they don't have access to that uranium. Now, that may seem small to some people, but it's huge. And we are seen now as having destroyed the flow of ammonia through pipelines to the West. Well, that means you can't develop effective fertilizer. This puts the whole green revolution in much of the world at risk. Because remember, the reason we have this enormous population on the planet in most of the developing world is because Europeans and Americans created the green revolution, the pesticides and the fertilizers that ensure the abundance of food. Well, if they go away, and that's the way it's beginning to look right now, that's going to create havoc and chaos all over Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. The whole thing's a disaster. It needs to stop. It's not about we're winning, they're losing. We've lost this particular operation. This is a dead end for us. We need a radical change in course. Demilitarize our relationship with most of the world. Recognize we can't bully everybody and get on with life. But nobody wants to go there, Clayton.
No, they want to do the opposite, and they're in a state of denial. And do you think that that is the end game here? Because, as I was sitting around just talking with family the other night, and I said, well, what does NATO hope to achieve here? What is the end game for NATO? Because if Putin does decide, well, we can't have this operation continuing in Kiev. Like, we need to take out the rest of this country. We need to secure it because we're going to continue to be attacked in Crimea and other targets. The only way for us to be secure is to completely take over this country. Is that the end game? Is that what NATO wants? It seems like they're pushing for it.
Well, I know it's not what the Russians want, because from the very beginning, Putin made it clear that he understands the Ukrainians in the West want nothing to do with Russia. He's always understood that. But he insisted on neutrality because he didn't want to be under attack from those regions where he knows the people are hostile to him. Well, that opportunity is now passed, and he doesn't want to go up there. So I think he is really looking for a way to avoid that, but he has to have a partner. And I think his best bet at this point is for Europeans to do something, to stop behaving as sort of obedient vassals of Greater Washington's empire and start behaving like Germans, like Frenchmen, like Italians. What are their interests? And if you look at their interests, they do not align whatsoever with this war against Russia. They never have. It's only the Poles, really, and to some extent the Lithuanians, maybe the Latvians, I don't know, that have been so violently anti-Russian and have insisted on this, along with Great Britain. Great Britain seems to be ruled by people not very different from the ones that are ruling us right now in Washington. And that's disappointing, but that's not Europe. So the Europeans could forge a different way ahead. And I hope that they do, because I don't see us doing much. Somebody said to me the other night, what do you think we'll do? And I said, well, go back and look at Vietnam. What happened in Vietnam? We just kind of packed up, pretended that we'd left everything better than it was. And of course, that wasn't true. We said we'd given the Vietnamese all we could. We'd trained their forces, and we left. And when things fell apart, what did people say? Well, we did all we could. They got everything, but we can't go on like this. And we changed the subject. I think something similar to that will mark the end of the war in Ukraine.
Wow. Or worse, Afghanistan, right? After this could drag on for another 15 years. And that's the really scary.
I don't think so, because Europe is not Afghanistan. And I think the Europeans won't tolerate that. They know that could lead to a regional war. That's the whole point. That if you let these Poles and Lithuanians stagger into Western Ukraine, you're essentially setting us up for a regional war. What's to stop the Russians then from saying, fine, we'll hit all the airports, all the airfields, all the storage locations, all the forces in Poland, in Lithuania? I mean, what's to stop them? They can hit them now. That was the point of striking Reni right there on the border with Romania. So I don't think so. I think the Europeans at that stage, I'd be very surprised if somebody just didn't stand up and say enough's enough. So I don't think the Afghan scenario is plausible. And I think anybody in the European governments, like this man Stoltenberg or Schultz or the rest of them, they'll be out on their ear. No one will want them.
Let's hope you're right. Let's hope you're right. I've seen some of these, United Kingdom politicians over the past few weeks saying, well, we could definitely go on for another 4 years, another 5 years.
Clayton, remember the problem with Great Britain is it's not very different from us. The British have this thing called the Channel between them and Europe, and they've always felt as though they could act with impunity. Yeah. I think they're mistaken. I mean, the Russians could visit them too. They don't think so, but it could happen. And I think the British take the wrong view. Charles de Gaulle said, the problem with NATO is that Americans don't live in Europe and Great Britain is an island. Oh. He was right.
Yeah, you're right about that. Let's see if there's any strong leadership in Europe, and we'll make a change on this. Colonel, great piece. I encourage all of our readers to check it out. I'll have it linked up in the show description. As always, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, great to see you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Clayton.